Hi guys, whenever the government is in a bit of a fix, you can always rely on the Conservatives to mess things up and create a distraction. So our old friend Chris Philp was recorded speaking to a group of people about an issue that the Tories seem to think they can defeat Labour with: immigration. However, contained within the recording is something that could cost Philp his job. You see, he spoke the truth about Brexit. Oops.
Well, Mark, in the week that the government is trying to tackle migration, legal migration at the start of the week, we're expecting something on illegal migration and asylum claims at the end of the week. The question is, did Brexit make it harder for the last Conservative government to deal with the migration and the spike in the migration numbers? That's the question. As Boris Johnson announced that he was taking back control, questions have been raised in the last few weeks about whether or not Tory frontbenchers agree with that. What's happened, Mark, is that we at Sky News have exclusively obtained some comments by Chris Philp, who is now the Shadow Home Secretary, who back in 2020 was the Immigration Minister, which appear to suggest that he believes, and they believed, that when it comes to asylum, there were flaws in the deal that we had at the point that we left Brexit, point that we Brexited, and the point at which he left EU controls. Let's hear what Chris Philp told a gathering of Tory members on Zoom just a few weeks ago at the end of April, when he was asked, why isn't there a better deal that we can strike with the EU, with countries like France, in order to take people home? Why didn't we do better on that?
Now, because we're out of the European Union now, we are out of the Dublin III regulations, and so we can't any longer rely on sending people back to the place where they first claimed asylum. When we did check it out, just before we exited the EU transitional arrangements on December the 31st, 2020, we did run some checks and found that about half the people crossing the Channel had claimed asylum previously elsewhere in Europe, in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, somewhere like that, and therefore could have been returned. But now we're out of Dublin, we can't do that, and that's why we need to have somewhere like Rwanda that we can send these people to as a deterrent.
This, Mark, I think is interesting and significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, it suggests that while publicly ministers were welcoming the fact that we were leaving the EU, insisting that we had a plan, and even Boris Johnson's spokesman suggesting that it was a good thing that we were going to leave that what's known as the Dublin Convention, which was an agreement with EU countries that asylum seekers could be returned to the first place that they made their claim. Behind closed doors, ministers were worried about that. That is something that we did not know. The second reason I think that this is important is because it suggests, if you listened closely to Chris Philp, that he was suggesting that they only did the research shortly before the moment that Britain left the European Union. Now, that will surprise some people because...
No, it won't surprise people like us, people who have been following this. Oh my goodness. You know, I've been saying for some time, I don't know if people like Chris Philp are stupid or they just pretend to be. Does this end that doubt? Does this end this conundrum? So the Tories have been saying for some time we needed to leave the European Union in order to take back control. And now that we're out of the European Union, we're able to control immigration. But there you have Chris Philp saying, well, actually, we didn't know what we were signing up for. We didn't know that when we left the European Union, we wouldn't be able to send people back to countries like France and Germany. Oh my God. Look, Chris Philp, I don't think was a Brexiteer. I think he voted Remain. But it shows that even people who knew that it was a bad idea to leave the European Union had to jump on board the Brexit bus. They had to defend leaving the European Union. And they probably got talking points from Tory Party HQ, which were at the time, Brexit is a good idea. Brexit would help us control immigration. Don't talk about sending asylum seekers back, people claiming asylum back to France or Germany, whatever. We'll talk about something else. And of course, they ran out of road at one stage, and then they started going down the Rwanda route. They realized we can't send people to other countries in Europe because we're no longer a member of the European Union. These are the sort of things that we were talking about before Boris Johnson Brexited. It would create problems leaving the European Union. How are you going to send people to other countries? How are you going to stop the boats? So, of course, they came up with Rwanda. And what happened to Rwanda? It was shut down because it's illegal. It's unlawful. The court said you can't send people to an unsafe country. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with Chris Philp. He may end up being sacked over this because he's really undermined a core aspect of Brexit. Remember, this is what got Brexit over the line, this idea we need to leave the European Union in order to control our borders. And this completely undermines that. So I don't know if Kemi Badenoch is going to fire Chris Philp over this, although he's telling the truth. There was no plan, and it made it more difficult sending people to these other countries because the UK was no longer part of the European Union. It'll be interesting to hear how this will be spun over the next number of days. But it's great for the Labour government because it creates a distraction. It shows Tory incompetence once again.